Hello, it's Wednesday the 5th of January and you're watching Scotland at 7 with me, Hugh Stewart in the Glasgow studios, and joining me tonight from Kirkliston is Peter Curran. So Peter, we'll be discussing today's news with you in a couple of minutes, if you wouldn't mind waiting while I read out today's coronavirus statistics. So as of 2 p.m. today, a total of 4,034,287 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs or the UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 3,034,963 have been confirmed negative, 999,324 have tested positive. There are 16,103 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. The figures being reported today will include a backlog from before Christmas. There are 5 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,872. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 1,123 were in hospital last night, 42 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,385,227 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 4,026,888 have received a second dose. That's 4,026,888. Also, 3,016,198 have received a third dose or booster. The latest UK daily figures show 149,284 patients who tested positive for COVID have sadly died from their illness. And that's an increase of 334 since yesterday. That number refers to deaths in all settings and not just hospitals. So Peter, before we look at the First Minister's announcement in Parliament today, just a quick brief look at the figures. So on the one hand, it's very good to see that there's a much smaller number of deaths being reported than before Christmas and New Year, only at 5 yesterday. It's very sad. We're sorry about the 5 people who have lost family members, but it was much more than that. So do you think maybe that's just that we haven't finished counting all of the holiday data yet, because there's a big increase of people in hospital, but not a big increase in intensive care? So,
well, I mean, trying to interpret these figures, I don't envy the First Minister, or indeed any First Minister or Prime Minister trying to reach their decisions in the view of expert advice. All I would say to them is, remember not to draw wildly extravagant conclusions from short-term variations. I mean, there is a law of big numbers. If you want to see a pattern, you need a lot of time. Unfortunately, in wartime and in COVID pandemic, you haven't got that luxury. You have to make decisions at the time. But there can be no certainties about these numbers. From one standpoint, they're encouraging. From another standpoint, you can say they're threatening. And if these decisions were being made objectively by politicians across UK, never mind the world, we could reach some sort of common sense accord. The fact is they're not. People are looking at the figures through the prism of what they want the figures to be telling them. Now, the First Minister is remarkably free from that. In fact, she's almost unique in that respect. Our stellar performance today on our briefing, it was an object lesson of how to answer, despite a scurrilous article by Neil Mackay in the Herald about her being dismissive of the press and the media and her opponents. Quite the reverse. She gives them an object lesson of clear, forensic, logical thinking, which they would do well to emulate. But she emphasised the point that she consults the experts, she takes their views on the figures, she looks at the figures herself, but she is the one that has to make the key decisions, because, as she rightly reminded them, we live in a democracy, and that's exactly what she's elected to do.
Yes, of course. Experts advise, but elected politicians decide. So on that then, let's move on to what the First Minister has actually suggested to Parliament today. First meeting of Parliament, a special meeting which was online to discuss, really the growth of the Omicron infections. So what the First Minister said is that changes are being made to self-isolation rules in line with public health advice and testing requirements to help maximise testing capacity and ensure a speedier start to the process of contact tracing. In her statement to the Scottish Parliament today, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon announced that anyone who tests positive for COVID-19, regardless of vaccination status, must still isolate for 10 days. However, from tomorrow, the 6th of January, new cases will be advised they can end their self-isolation if they don't have a fever and test negative on a lateral flow device. That's an LFD. So they have to test on day 6 and again at least 24 hours after that. Triple vaccinated close contacts of those who test positive, whether household or non-household, or those under the age of 18 years and 4 months, do not need to isolate as long as they return a negative LFD test result each day for 7 consecutive days and also remain fever-free. The intention is for the public to be sufficiently reassured of a negative COVID-19 status during its potential incubation period. Any close contact who is not fully vaccinated, and that means 3 doses, will still have to self-isolate for 10 days and take a PCR test. Now, changes are also being made to testing. After a positive LFD test, people no longer will be asked to take a PCR test to confirm that result. Instead, anyone with a positive LFD test should report that result online as soon as the test is done. This ensures that people can get the advice they need as quickly as possible. After reporting the result, people should then fill in the online form they will receive so that contacts can also be informed and rapidly given the correct advice. So those are the changes. So first of all, we should underline, the First Minister said today, there's no major change to the mitigation measures. So that means let's just go over what we were doing previously, keep on doing it. So still wear masks in public places, certainly buses and trains, that's compulsory. And again, the overall limits, crowd limits on large gatherings, that still applies. And finally, of course, restaurant and cafes, seated table service only. So those measures are still in place. So the 2 changes, Peter, are, let's look first of all at the relaxation, or partial relaxation of the need to isolate for 10 days down to 7 days. As you were saying earlier, it's a difficult choice. You think the First Minister was partly thinking about the political pressure that she's been under to change that to 7 days?
Well, looking at that particular measure, Hugh, and all the other ones, got to remind ourselves of the dilemma that faces the First Minister and any other politician. Any measure used to combat the virus has a very definite negative effect on the economy. Any measure to protect the economy has a very definite negative effect on the malevolence, if you like, of the virus. How do you balance these things out? And the old American saying is there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every decision to do something is a decision because time's finite and resources are finite not to do something else. And the other thing the First Minister has been very good at emphasising, but the media has been snail-like assimilating the message, is all political leaders are learning as they go along. The last pandemic on this scale, this may well exceed its scale, was the Spanish flu of 1918, in a world that was hugely different in terms of its movement of people, its demographic movements, its medical sophistication, its data analysis. And this is the real, all politicians have learned as they went along. But the political, small-minded political reaction to that is any change by a politician is a U-turn on an evidence that their first decision was an example of bad judgment. I mean, unless we cut that language out of it. The First Minister made a key point, and it's escaped a lot of intelligent people I know, and I had to explain it to them and remind myself of it. And that is, when somebody is admitted to hospital with COVID, it doesn't mean that COVID was the reason they were admitted to hospital. But somebody admitted to hospital with COVID that has perhaps very minor symptoms but the main cause of their admission is perhaps a heart attack or something else. They still have to have special measures applied, which cost crucially short time and resources to deal with the potential for them to infect other patients. Now, it's simple logical analysis like that the Prime Minister, First Minister excels at, and the media seems oblivious to, that is the key bridge between scientific and statistical figures and analysis and recommendations and political judgment. So I think she's doing the right thing. I can quote an unrelated thing, but illustrates the same point. Most men over a certain age die with prostate cancer, but they don't die of prostate cancer. It's not immediately threatening. It's a general degeneration of old age. And it's that kind of insight to understand these things in the nature of figures. So I think our decision on that and our decision on the related things of shortening the isolation periods, etc., all make perfect sense in the light of what we know now. When I got my mail delivered today, I said to the postman, "Happy New Year, how are you?" And he said, "Well, it's been interesting. I've had COVID, had to self-isolate. My period of self-isolation ended, and my son, who lives with me, has COVID, and he's had to self-isolate." So the self-isolation causes impact on individuals, potentially on their earnings, as impact on the organizations that they work with. And only a complex reading of statistical advice, statistical analysis, and data that is changing by the day. Again, something the media doesn't seem to understand. I mean, the print media,
Yes, yes.
is a day late.
Yes, of course. I think you're quite right to say it's a balancing act of any decision maker has to look at a whole array of different types of evidence. And yes, as you point out, Peter, yes, we've not been here before. All governments have been learning. Just before we move on, though, we will point out that the Scottish government seems to have been doing rather better than the English government because the COVID rates, the infection rates are lower in Scotland. And that's presumably because we've continued with the mitigation measures. We never relaxed wearing masks, etc. Anyway, so the measures are working. Now let's just move on. Obviously, we're going to come back to that again because, just before we move on, the First Minister also said that this is not the only variant. The Omicron is just the latest, and we shouldn't be surprised if there are others. So she also announced today that there's going to be developed a new plan, a kind of a dynamic plan to deal with the next version. So as you said, Peter, yes, things are changing, and this virus itself will change, and so they're preparing a plan. It's not ready now, but that plan will be announced as they discuss it with experts over the next couple of weeks. Yep, just quickly on that.
You know, the COVID viruses are a life form trying to establish dominance by occupying as many hosts as they can. Ultimately, that's a self-defeating strategy because if they kill all the hosts, nobody to dominate. It's also a motto for empires and dying empires like the disunited kingdom.
I never thought of that analogy, Peter. Yep. Now, talking about the United Kingdom, we have a story here about the amount of the renewable energy it generates. Today, new figures show that Scotland generated nearly a quarter of the United Kingdom's renewable energy in 2020. Scotland produced 32 gigawatts, that is 23.8% of the UK's total renewable energy in 2020, despite accounting for only 8% of the UK population. SNP's energy spokesman Alan Brown MP said, "Tackling the climate emergency is the most pressing political issue of the present day, so it's welcome to see such a significant percentage of the UK's renewable energy being generated in Scotland on our pathway to net zero." As Scotland moves away from oil and gas, securing a just transition for workers is a key priority of the SNP Scottish Government, and the booming renewables sector is essential to market confidence. Yet, while this progress is to be celebrated, Scotland faces the highest charges in the UK to connect to the energy grid, while the south of England are paid to connect. This is ludicrous. This postcode lottery is just another cost of Scotland being under Westminster control. It is time that the outdated charging system is scrapped and plans made to further incentivise electricity generation based on the best locations for renewable energy. So 3 cheers for the Scottish renewable sector. Peter, would you agree it's been built in spite of the UK government rather than through its assistance?
Oh, I would agree with that, absolutely. I would also emphasise that, especially in the pages of the Herald, there are regular attacks on the Scottish government's reliance, as they put it, on renewables. Now, for a start, the Scottish government does not rely on renewables, nor could they, even though they might dearly want to at the present stage of development. But what happens from its critics is they attack only the wind power on the fairly simplistic thing that the wind doesn't blow all the time, whereas nuclear reactors operate all the time until they decimate half the planet. They're entirely reliable until you have a Chernobyl or 3 Mile Island or wind scale disaster that will affect us for 10,000 years as we wait for the half-life to degenerate of the lethal substances we've produced. So they focus on that. They tend not to look at the wave power and all the other aspects of renewable. Now, thank God, the letters column of the Herald is an oasis of lunacy and an oasis of common sense. And I have to say, with a completely objective and non-bigoted standpoint, all the common sense comes from the yes side of the constitutional argument, and all the bollocks comes from the unionist side. Fortunately, we have sterling contributors that argue a calm, rational case. I'll cite 2, Alistair Galloway, I've got his name right, of Dumbarton, and the indefatigable Ruth Marr, who constantly talk calm, good sense and present facts objectively. So it's vital that what is happening in Scotland with renewables is recognised. And we have no choice but to go the renewables route in whichever way we can. It's not as if we have a choice. Nuclear at some imagined point in the distant future might be a totally safe thing. But on the old risk consequences matrix basis of damage control, you look at the likelihood of something, statistical likelihood of a negative event happening, and the force of the damage it does. I give the analogy if somebody says, before you open that door, I should tell you, you might bump your head as you go out. You'll take the risk quite happily because bumping your head's not going to be lethal. If somebody says, by the way, before you open that door, you should know there's a man-eating tiger outside, but I know you have to go out, evaluate the risks. You'll do a very different risk evaluation.
Yeah,
so
just wait and see.
We're not liable to die from wind turbines blowing up and devastating half the country, whereas we are with nuclear reactors.
No, I've yet to hear of anyone dying being struck by the blades of a nuclear turbine. Just before we move on from this story, the other point that the SNP was making, of course, is the network charges. I didn't realise this though, but each generator has to sell their electricity to the grid. But the grid charges a differential rate. They charge many times in Scotland what a generator's charged for England. Based on the sound, I know you're a sound logician, Peter, based on the sound logic that the customers in the south and the generators, some of the generators in the north, it costs a lot of money to send your electrons from Aberdeen to get it down to Birmingham, right? So obviously we have to pay more for it. So can you see any logic to this idea of a differential pricing system that they use to sell your electricity to the grid?
Well, I must say that I have no real expertise in this. We all have a friend and colleague in Ian Wright, who is deeply knowledgeable about these things. But like all people who have a deep knowledge of a complex subject, the great difficulty is trying to explain that to people like me. I mean, I'm numerate in the sense that a bookie's runner is numerate. I use basic arithmetic and operate fast, but I don't have an advanced grasp of mathematics, and I don't have a detailed knowledge of that. And there, like Nicola or any politician, I would have to say, you have to let the expert speak for me here. And then I would offer my opinion. But like you, Hugh, I can't see any sense in it. But then I can't see any sense in the way my electricity bill operates. They keep coming on and tell me they want me to pay less or pay more. And I say, I know nothing about it. And I put them on to the real expert, who's my wife. And she puts them right and gives them some hard common sense, and they apologise and they change it.
However, I think one thing I think we can say for sure is if Scotland were in control of its own energy grid, I don't think it would charge itself a punitive tax for distributing the electricity. Right. So let's move on again. I wish we had 2 hours, Peter. Maybe we should do a specials one of these days. I'm going to move on to a story that came from Westminster today at Prime Minister's Questions. The SNP has called for the UK government to introduce an emergency financial package to help families cope with the growing UK cost of living crisis, as household budgets are increasingly squeezed by UK government cuts, aggressive tax hikes and soaring energy bills. Speaking at Prime Minister's Questions today, Ian Blackford MP cited new research from the Resolution Foundation showing that on average, families will be £1,200 worse off from next April, which Mr Blackford said would be a catastrophic blow to millions of households. The SNP Westminster leader warned that 2022 will be the year of the squeeze for family budgets and called on Boris Johnson to take urgent action with an emergency financial package to support families, including introducing a UK-wide child payment of £20 per week per child and an energy payment for low-income households. Commenting, Ian Blackford, who's the SNP's Westminster leader, said, "Over Christmas, serious warnings have grown over the Tory cost of living crisis, which will hit the majority of families this year. New research from the Resolution Foundation has found that on average, families will be £1,200 worse off from April as a result of Tory cuts, tax hikes and soaring energy bills. For members of the Tory government, £1,200 might not seem very much. For the Foreign Secretary, it's just another taxpayer-funded lunch in Mayfair. For a Prime Minister, it's just a roll of fancy wallpaper for his taxpayer-funded flat. But for the vast majority of families, losing £1,200 a year will be catastrophic. For some, it will mean they can't afford to pay their rent and bills, heat their homes or put food on the table." The point I wanted to ask you about on this, Peter, because everyone knows prices are going up, energy bills are certainly shooting up, and of course the tax hike Ian Blackford referred to as probably the increase in national insurance to pay for the English healthcare system. So those prices are going up. That's not debatable. But what is debatable is that Ian Blackford said to the Prime Minister, "You're not doing anything but poverty." And the Prime Minister said, "Yes, we are. Poverty is getting lower under the Conservatives." The Prime Minister argued that under his government, the gap between rich and poor is smaller. So how can people make sense of that? One party says people are getting poorer and struggling, and the government says, "No, they're not. They're doing fine." How can people make sense of this argument about reality?
Well, if I may, just before I come to answering that, Hugh, let me say that the way Boris Johnson behaved to Ian Blackford today, I thought was thoroughly contemptible. I mean, basically, yes, Ian Blackford had a go at him and had a go at the manifest fact that for someone in Boris Johnson's position, they wouldn't appreciate what was happening to ordinary people and the impact of £1,200. This £1,200 figure, by the way, over the years of the constitutional debate, seems to be a magic figure that keeps popping up in all sorts of contexts, but leave that, stick to the wall. Anyway, Johnson's response was to basically say that Ian Blackford was playing the humble crofter. Now, a thoroughly contemptible remark. Ian Blackford is a very successful businessman, understands banking, but he also understands the root basis of crofting and his constituency, and he's been there and done it. Unlike our old Etonian Prime Minister, born with a silver spoon in his mouth, who has never done anything except some cheap and highly dubious journalism, and then some politics that defy description, to just dismiss it. But he has no choice. And of course, Parliament structured so it was he had his baying mob behind him. But I mean, on that, what can you say? We want to be out of this union that does these things, and we want to be free of a succession of Tory or even Labour governments that will do that, or worse, perhaps launch us into an illegal war under another Knight of the Garter. So what I say is, Ian Blackford and the SNP, while we're in the union, have to make these appeals in the tiny, vague hope, a forlorn hope in every sense of the word, that some humanity will emerge, or some competence even, from the Westminster government. But it's not going to happen. These people don't care. I mean, that particular lunch, which was taken by The Guardian, people have tried to defend it on the cost of the lunch. The cost of the lunch was an incidental. What mattered is why that lunch was held there, and the relationships between the proprietors of that restaurant and the Tory party and the nations and the financial status of that restaurant. That was the key point. These people live in a world completely detached from the realities of ordinary people. 1,200 a year is 24 quid a week. I know, as growing up in very deprived circumstances and as a young married man on a limited income with a young family, just what small amounts of money could make a dramatic difference, not to your lifestyle or your leisure time, but the very fundamentals of life. A Tory government will never understand that.
Yes, of course. And Mr. Blackford was obviously referring to the £20 uplift to the child payment, which comes in. It's £10 at the moment, but it comes in to £20 in the April financial year. And Blackford is saying, why don't you do that for England as well? So Johnson says, OK, I'm looking after people in England, but he's not. OK, so I have to move on, Peter. Now, you mentioned earlier on a member of the Order of the Garter, I think that's what it's called. The next story concerns Tony Blair's former Defence Secretary, who was Jeff Hugh, who has claimed that he was told to burn a memo from the Attorney General which cast doubt on the legality of the Iraq war. In revelations that critics say cast further doubt on the decision to award the former Prime Minister a knighthood, Mr. Hugh recalled in extracts from his recently published memoir that Blair's Chief of Staff had instructed him to burn the document. Jeff Hugh wrote in his memoir, See How They Run, that he had been under pressure from Mike Boyce, the Chief of Defence Staff, to provide him with clear legal directions that his forces could take action in Iraq in lieu of a United Nations resolution authorising force, according to press reports. He claims to have received a copy of complex advice from the then Attorney General Lord Goldsmith, which was, Mr. Hugh said, very long and very detailed legal opinion. He wrote, I was sent a copy from Downing Street under conditions of considerable secrecy. I was told that it was for my eyes only and I should not discuss its contents with anyone else. I had no idea who else received a copy. Mr. Hugh said the advice was not an easy read and concluded that the Iraq invasion would be lawful only if the Prime Minister believed that it was in the United Kingdom's national interest to do so. Mr. Hugh stated that when his principal private secretary, Peter Watkins, called Jonathan Powell in Downing Street to ask what he should now do with the document, he was told in no uncertain terms that he should burn it. Mr. Hugh said the document was not burned. Instead, it was locked securely into an MOD safe. He says, for all I know, it's probably still there. More than 700,000 people have now signed a petition to rescind Blair's knighthood awarded by the Queen in the New Year honours list, but the decision to award him the honour was defended yesterday by Labour leader Keir Starmer. So this concerns a legal war. Now, this takes me back, of course, I'd forgotten about this, but before Blair and the current President of America, George Bush, decided to attack Iraq, they had, of course, spent some time trying to get the United Nations to officially sanction it. So the war went ahead in spite of the UN not declaring war on Iraq. And so, along with the Americans, we declared war on Iraq. So legality is what it was all about, wasn't it? Remember in those days, was it legal to invade Iraq? And Labour, even left-wing Labour people were saying, not only is it legal, it's our duty to defend the people of Iraq by removing its evil leader. So it was, legality. What do you think is the situation? When should you have... Is there ever a good time to have a war? Is there ever a legal war?
a legal war is a very dodgy concept to start with. But if you had to say when should there be a point when a war is legal or not, it's when the United Nations, after due consideration of its member nations, decided that a war was necessary to protect some fundamental principle of international law, the autonomy of individual nations, or to inhibit or stop the behavior of certain nations. But the United Nations has never been in a position to do that. One, it has certain parties in it have the right of veto, and the big powers, while paying lip service to the United Nations when it suits them, have never been willing to cede that power. I mean, at the time all this was happening, you remember when the evidence was beginning to be gathered, there was two events at that time. There was the doctor who'd been in Iraq, I forget his name, who committed suicide because he knew the reality of the situation and was being victimized by the government because he was trying to tell the truth. In the United States, quite incredibly, I wish I could remember the names from the top of my head, there was a senator whose wife was a highly placed CIA operative in the Middle East. And a question came up about the use of certain component parts, a shipment of certain items that were used in the construction of a nuclear power plant and nuclear weapons. And there was systematic lies and distortion. And she, CIA member though that she was an honest woman and tried to question this, as the senator did. They then victimized both of these people, a United States senator and his wife, and deliberately and blatantly exposed her name, resulting in the fact that she might have been killed and a whole series of her contacts that had placed their trust in her in the Middle East were killed. That's the appalling behavior that surrounded the Bush regime. And what did we have there? A man consumed by personal vanity and inhibited by very poor judgment, Tony Blair, saw his opportunity to strut on an international stage. Tony Blair would have sold his soul, and in a very real sense did send his soul, to walk in the footsteps of the likes of George Bush. And by God, did he back the wrong horse there for the world, for his own reputation. It didn't do his acquisition of billions of pounds as a result of it any harm. But
Yes,
his knighthood is an absolute effrontery to any concept of justice, equity, or humanity, frankly.
yes, it was certainly, probably in the long run, it was it's what brought Blair down. Very successful Prime Minister, won 3 elections with big majorities, even bigger than Johnson's. But really, it was the fact that well, let's face it, he lied to the British people, because if I just go over the legal terms, what they eventually decided was it is legal if the Prime Minister says it's legal, based on it being in the UK's national interest. But I've gone, the chap you were referring to, who unfortunately committed suicide, was Dr. David Kelly. And he was really bringing to light the so-called dodgy dossier, because the government, the Blair government, put together so-called evidence about weapons of mass destruction, and it turned out that these, of course, did not exist. But the dossier was what David Kelly was talking about, and it was complete rubbish. So the legality of the attack on Iraq was this nonsense document saying it is in UK's national interest because Saddam Hussein's about to attack London. Rubbish, wasn't it?
It was based on 2 things, Hugh. It was based on that lie about we were within 45 minutes of a nuclear strike on Britain. Yeah. A systematically massaged lie between America and Britain, and the question of a legal war. The next war won't be legal. Unilaterally, one country will decide to, based on a mistake, bad judgment, or sheer lunacy, will launch some kind of military adventure which will trigger the use of nuclear weapons, and nobody will be legalizing it at the button. The commander-in-chief of the United States can ignore all legalities and all democracy and retreat into his own judgment as the supreme arbiter of whether the world lives or dies. And exactly the same prevails in Russia.
Yeah, I'm afraid might is right, as they say eventually. The winner claims the spoils. Now, moving on to another story from last year, was it, when the statue of the industrialist and slave trader Edward Colston was chucked into the harbour of Bristol. Now, today we learn that 3 men and a woman have been found not guilty of criminal damage after toppling the statue of slave trader Edward Colston during a Black Lives Matter protest in Bristol. This was an act of public dissent which reverberated around the world. The 4 were Rhian Graham, Milo Ponsford, Sage Willoughby, were accused of, with others unknown, of helping to tie ropes around the statue's neck and joining with others to pull it to the ground. Jake Scouse was accused of helping to roll it into the Bristol harbour, where it was thrown into the River Avon. In a 10-day trial at Bristol Crown Court, the 4 defendants did not contest their actions on the 7th of June last year, but sought to argue they were justified because the statue was so offensive. Giving evidence in their own defence, each describes being motivated out of a sincere anti-racist conviction and frustration that previous attempts to persuade the council to remove the statue had failed, and a belief that the statue was so offensive it constituted an indecent display or a hate crime. The prosecution, however, argued that the fact that Colston was a slave trader was wholly irrelevant. William Hughes QC for the Crown said the case was about cold, hard facts and the rule of law. The prosecution showed jurors a CCTV video compilation capturing each of the 4 defendants playing a role in toppling Colston's statue. Bristol Council's head of culture, John Finch, gave evidence of the damage caused to the statue, which lost a cane and part of a coat tail. He confirmed £350 of damage to the harbour railings and £2,400 damage to the pavement. Liam Walker QC, representing Willoughby, said each of these defendants were on the right side of history and they were also on the right side of the law. And he added that while Colston's deeds may be historical, the continued reverberation of him in a vibrant, multicultural city like Bristol was an act of abuse. Sage Willoughby, who climbed the statue, told the court he targeted Colston because he was a racist and a slave trader who murdered thousands and enslaved even more. Jen Scouse admitted helping to roll Colston to Piero's Bridge, named after an enslaved man who lived in Bristol, where it was thrown into the water. The 4 defendants laughed with relief as the verdicts were returned and hugged the many supporters who were waiting outside the court when they were released from the dock. So that event last year was one of many events really, I suppose, precipitated by the Black Lives Matter protest in America, which focused on statues or reminders of the past, reminders from another history, another century when history looked different. Is this about reassessing our past, or is it about trying to cancel history?
Well, let me tell you a brief, very, very brief anecdote on this, which will illustrate what I'm about to say. Reading and rereading over the last 20 years this excellent book, which I have no commercial interest in whatsoever. It's by a guy called David Ross, and it's an anthology and a compilation of stories about Scotland going back from the 15th century right through to modern times. In relatively modern times, the 1930s, a well-known politician of the time, I think it might have been Jimmy Maxton, was jailed for sedition because he'd been demonstrating or doing something. And he went into jail with his new cellmate. He said, how are you going? The cellmate says, what are you in for, mate? And he said, I'm in for sedition. And the cellmate looked at him and said, for God's sake, man, you should have married the lassie. Now, what I'm about to say may come close to sedition, but let's start with the statues. Why are statues erected? They're erected to commemorate either an event in the sense of a mural, the kind of things that stand at the base of the man with the cone in his head outside the old Royal Exchange building in Glasgow. But there's a nice little mural around that. Or they're to commemorate an individual. And point one, these statues are rarely a work of art. They don't belong anywhere in the pantheon of the great works of sculpture. So they have no particular merit. They're competently done, and they're very often hack work. And they're elected by whoever is in power at the moment, erected rather, because they favoured the actions of this person. Hence the proliferation of statues of some of the most awful bloody old villains that have ever walked the earth. Now, occasionally they're erected to decent people. Nobody, I think, is going to pull down a statue of Florence Nightingale or somebody who invented a cure for cancer or whatever. But they are an affront when public opinion and public sensibilities and public understanding moves on. And they should be taken down quietly. They should be regarded as temporary. And yeah, let the next regime stick up their statue of Boris the Faithful Johnson astride a white charger, lashing his blonde locks around in the hair. I mean, it would give me, to use an old Glasgow word, which I hope nobody remembers, to go and throw a tolly at it. So these things have their fun side. But pulling down the statue was a criminal act. Now, I was wholly in favour of it. I'm delighted by it. And I'm even more delighted that that group of young people who had the nerve and the farce did an act in the context of the times, and that's the important thing, as you said, the Black Lives Matter, etc., took it upon themselves to take the risks of doing this very risky gesture, not only in the pulling of the damn thing down, but dragging it through the streets and dumping it in the water. And it was far more powerful than a ream of blogs, speeches, media analysis, or anything else could do. And it reverberated around the world, and it had its desired result. So I'm delighted to see them getting off. But when you do that kind of thing, you've got to be prepared to face that the law at the time will act against you, as the Extinction Rebellion people have emphasised in the beginning. We'll do the act because we think it's right, and we'll face the consequences, and we'll argue our case as best we can. Now, the interesting thing is that the law here comes down on what I see as the side of common sense and right, but they only did that because of the context of the times. Mm-hmm. If that had been done at any point before the Black Lives, say 50 years ago, these people would have been in jail, accused of a very serious crime. I mean, I link that to something like the theft of the Stone of Destiny. Again, a hugely bold gesture with huge risks involved in it. And initially, the state was all for throwing the book at them, and then they saw common sense. And I think Scotland is rapidly approaching the point where we need to make more of these gestures. We need to push against the bounds of the restraints carefully and with a careful judgment, a recognition that they'll break somebody's law, but they've got to be done. So I'm delighted. I'm glad they did it. I think it made a significant impact in Britain and around the world, and in the Black Lives Matter thing, and I'm delighted that they got off.
Indeed. The interesting thing, just before we move on from that story, is I looked up, it was actually a jury trial. So it wasn't unanimous, but 10 citizens out of 12 in Bristol, they looked at what you said, and yes, it was an illegal act, as the prosecutor said, but they decided it was justified. So obviously the jury were a law in this case. So the jury.
I mean, the senior police officer, just briefly commenting on television tonight, said this is the most unusual and perhaps unique case where the population were almost evenly divided on the question. Mm-hmm. So it's hugely difficult judgment to make, to prosecute initially and to follow through for the prosecuting authorities and the police. So I don't malign them for doing it. A patently illegal act had occurred. It was a highly public act. It was an act of defiance. They had to do. I bet you a lot of the police officers and the prosecuting authorities were crossing their fingers and saying, I hope this fails. Not the action fails, but the prosecution fails. So you've got to have some measure of understanding. But the outcome, the joy in that young girl's face and the Coulson Four will go down in history now, and they deserve to. Our sheer joy and almost tears of joy were a delight to see.
Yeah, it's interesting, yes. So the people of Bristol, maybe in the form of that jury, have made their own decision on that. Now, moving quickly on to the next story, Peter, we'll just very briefly discuss a story that no doubt affects a lot of us, you and me. The SNP has said that independence is the only way to protect Scotland's pensioners, as new analysis reveals that almost 1 million Scottish pensioners have been directly impacted by the UK government's plan to scrap the triple lock. The House of Commons Library research concluded that 985,065 pensioners in Scotland have been directly impacted by the cut, which will see them lose £520 in this year and a cumulative £2,600 over the next 5 years. The UK government's households below average income statistics show that the UK pension poverty had risen to a 15-year high, with 2.1 million UK pensioners, that's 18%, now living in poverty after housing costs. And that's an increase of 200,000 from the previous year, well, from the year 2018-19. Separate analysis from the House of Commons Library conducted in June revealed that UK pensions are the least generous in North-West Europe in comparison to the average wage. Commenting, the SNP's Work and Pension spokesperson David Linden MP said, "For as long as Scotland gets Tory governments we don't vote for, Scotland's pensioners will continue to see their incomes slashed. Under Westminster control, the UK pensioners already have the least generous pensions in North West Europe, and things are only getting worse." So the triple lock was, I think, that pensions were guaranteed to increase by the rate of inflation, or by the amount of average wages, or by 2.5%, whichever was the greatest. So the Tories have said, forget about that. And so that's the consequence. Now, I no doubt Boris Johnson, if he was here, would say, no, they're not, they're getting bigger, but they're going up. But they're not. So this is research from House of Commons Library. So just very quickly, my question is this. Can Scotland do better? Can Scotland say to pensioners, well, it'll be £250 a week if you vote for independence? That's a winner, isn't it? Why don't we just do that?
Well, it can. It can. But as somebody who was involved with pensions in my human resource role for most of my working life, Hugh, great caution is needed before you make precise commitments on pensions. And over the years, over the decades, I've seen more bollocks talked about pensions by politicians and by directors of major companies than enough. If I may give an example, when I joined Scottish and Newcastle in 1974, they were still in the heyday of the brewing industry, when people just queued up to drink the beer, and if you were well placed in the company, you eventually got a peerage, which was called a beerage. And the beerage were well known, that the brewers who'd been ennobled for getting people monumentally pissed. And I'm happy that somebody should get ennobled for that. But they operated, and the pension schemes operated on the assumption that very few of their employees would ever reach pension age. They would probably die, either from acute alcoholism or from serious bone disease, from handling a £150 steel cask in and out of cellars. But if they did live, they wouldn't live very much longer after pension age. So we had hugely liberal policies with huge parties for pensioners. And then somebody began to notice that the number of pensioners we had exceeded the people we had employed, and the bill and pensioners were coming along boasting that they'd just become an octogenarian, and the company was going white. I mean, I worked for Scottish and Newcastle, now Heineken, for 14 years, but I've been their pensioner for, 34 years. And in that time, I've drawn pensions from them infinitely, totaling more than the total, even in real terms. That was not their intention when they founded the scheme. To give them their credit, they and Heineken, since that, have stood by their obligations and have managed the scheme impeccably. And I'm quite happy about it, even though it's only a component part of my income. What a pension does is makes a commitment typically to an 18-year-old who joins the company and joins the pension scheme, what they will pay you for the rest of your life after 40 years have elapsed. Tell me how many companies make that kind of long-term decision making.
Well, I think that's part of the... Yeah, I know. Those days are gone. And yeah, of course, the key dynamics, as you pointed out, Peter, are, first of all, people like you and me insist on living longer. I'm planning to do it for quite a long time yet. And of course, the fact that the old company pensions, there's very few of them. So what we're talking about here is the state pension rather than the company pension, but it's definitely not increasing with inflation. In reality, it means it's getting smaller.
Apply.
Sorry,
Same considerations apply,
Yeah.
Hugh, that the state will make commitments that seemed okay at the time, and election-winning commitments, and then realise under a time of acute financial pressure that they can't live with them. And any state is capable of reneging legitimately, in inverted commas, on a hard commitment that they made in their manifesto on the basis of material change of circumstances. We've heard that in a whole series of things. Material change of circumstances, COVID here. Actually, there's a theory that the COVID virus was invented by the pension companies to escape from their commitments. If we can't renege on the commitment, we can at least kill the pensioners.
Well, we're not going to spread that on broadcast in Scotland. Anyway, let's move on, Peter, to the anniversary of the attack on the Capitol in Washington, which is tomorrow, the 6th of January. President Biden will mark the first anniversary of the deadly assault on the US Capitol this Thursday by honouring the bravery of law enforcement on the scene and outlining the unfinished work that the nation needs to do to strengthen its democracy, the White House said in its first preview of the president's remarks. On Thursday, the president is going to speak to the truth of what happened, not the lies that some have spread since, and the peril it has posed to the rule of law and our system of democratic governance, the White House spokesperson Jen Psaki told reporters on Tuesday afternoon, that's today, yesterday afternoon, sorry. The preview came as ex-President Donald Trump announced he was cancelling his own anniversary event, a press conference at Mar-a-Lago in Florida, which had been scheduled for the evening of the 6th of January. Several Republicans had expressed concern about Trump's news conference overshadowing the somber day. Yesterday, the House committee investigating the 6th of January insurrection has issued a letter seeking the cooperation of Fox News host Sean Hannity, who exchanged messages with Trump and his chief of staff Mark Meadows in the days leading up to the attack. President Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris will speak on Thursday morning at the US Capitol 1 year after the mob of Trump supporters attacked the complex in a failed attempt to stop the counting of Electoral College votes, which officially delivered Biden's election victory. Jen Psaki said that President Biden will put an extra spotlight on the role of Capitol Police and others on the scene. Because of their efforts, our democracy withstood an attack from a mob, and the will of more than 150 million people who voted in the presidential election was ultimately registered, said Ms. Psaki, who went on to say that President Biden will continue to speak to everyone in the country, including those who didn't vote for him, those who may not believe he is the legitimate president, about what he wants to do to make their lives better. Okay, a fact here. We like to do facts in broadcasting in Scotland. Peter, on November 2019, Joe Biden won the election. So this is all about the fact that many millions of Americans think he stole the election. They complete the reverse, because Donald Trump, I read recently, is employing a lot of lawyers now to try and steal the 24 election. So once again, as I said earlier on about Prime Minister's credibility, how do people believe nonsense in this world of information?
Well, among the most depressing and horrific and stop me in my tracks films or videos or television reports I've seen in my lifetime, the first one was the D-Day landings, and although they were heavily censored, you got some idea of the horror that the troops were facing. I mean, we never saw a dramatisation of it until the film Saving Private Ryan showed you really what did happen. The other one was the videos that were coming through, reports around the Bay of Pigs crisis, when I could hit me viscerally that the world was at risk here. But the storming of the Capitol and the inside videos of that, it created in me an utter horror at the thought, yes, that people could be hurt and even killed here, as they were. But this was being perpetrated at the instigation of an American president, and it might well herald the collapse of democracy as anybody knows it in the United States. I mean, the significance of that event is enormous. It's quite incredible. And what's been happening since, with the election of Biden, the claims of the election being stolen, etc., you realize that democracy is a very tenuous concept when it comes to the mass of the people. Basically, what we say to the people, regardless, unless you're a certifiable idiot or jailed for some serious crime, you have a vote that can unseat a government. But you only get to exercise that once in a while. Thereafter, the government has to govern the reasonable people in the bamports, of which every nation is comprised of, hopefully not in equal measure. Unfortunately, in the United States, there's a very big question of where the majority lies. And they have to be governed for that period. But when the very process of government is attacked by somebody who owes their power to the mechanisms of democracy, you're really at a dangerous point. I don't know how we deal with this. I have to say, and again, I don't want to offend against Broadcasting Scotland's delicacy on certain matters, but organised religion plays a big part in the problem here, as it does across the globe. In the centre of every major problem we have in the globe at the moment, there's a dimension of organised religion, because the very nature of religion is built on faith. It can never be proven. And once you're prepared to believe one thing that is not justified by logic, but simply by inner belief, you can believe anything thereafter. And it's no accident that the countries in America that most heavily support the Republican Party, a ludicrous misnomer now, the grand old party, they're certainly old, they're certainly not grand anymore, come from what is known as the Bible Belt, and for very good reason. That the people there owe allegiance to a higher cause, not being able to tap into the invisible God. They have to have a manifestation of him on earth. And for the Bible Belt, it's Donald Trump.
Yes, it's very odd that they chose Trump as their earthly manifestation. Yeah, he wasn't known as a churchgoer himself until that photo opportunity. Right, Peter, it's been great talking to you tonight. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more story. We've only got a very brief time, so let me just return to a story we've covered before about the difficulties in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The United States on Wednesday, that's today, imposed fresh sanctions on the Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik, who aims to take the Serb Republic out of Bosnia's armed forces. He's been accused of corruption and threatening the stability and territorial integrity of Bosnia-Herzegovina. A UK Treasury Department spokesman said they've slapped sanctions on the media outlet Alternativa Televizija in Banja Luka, that's his television station, accusing Dodik of acquiring it to further his own agenda and exerting personal control over it. The designations are the first use of an executive order issued in June, allowing the United States to target those who threaten peace or stability in the Western Balkans. Bosnia is experiencing its gravest political crisis since the end of the war of the 1990s, reviving fear of a breakup of the Bosnians after the Bosnian Serbs blocked the work of the central government and Serb lawmakers voted to start pulling the autonomous Serb Republic out of the state institutions. So I haven't got time to go over the rest of this story, but it's something we will probably return to, Peter. But just interesting to note that peace in Bosnia is guaranteed by America. So just underlines how complicated things are, aren't they? We've been talking about the difficult balance of keeping democracy in America, but one side of America clearly has a role to play in democracy, both here, of course, in Northern Ireland, with the peace agreement, and also the peace agreement at about the same time, which they brokered in Bosnia. So America's trying to, well, it's complicated, isn't it? America are not the bad guys all the time, would you say? So
I'm reluctant to venture any opinion on this because I know, standing not too far from us, there's a lady who knows infinitely more about these politics than I do. And there's a lot of people better equipped to answer it. I mean, I can only have very superficial views on this. I just don't know enough to offer an informed opinion. So
I'm afraid we just have to end it there. But again, as I said before, 4. That's a story we're definitely going to come back to. So, Peter, yeah, we must do a longer show one day. We just haven't got enough time to go into these topics and the depth they require. With
Some of these days.
So let me just finish.
Giant,
So I thank you, Peter, once again for joining me from Kirkliston, and also thanking our viewers and the subscribers. If you look at our website, an appeal for funds on the website, and we have a target of £500,000. If we can raise £500,000 this year, we'll do practically, well, we won't be doing 24/7, but we'll be doing about 6 programs a day, and we'll be employing people here, and that's what we intend to do. And if we can increase the support from our subscribers, we're going to widen out the range of programs and maybe give Peter and myself a bit longer to get into these topics in the depth they require. Okay, so that's it from me tonight and from Peter. So we'll see you again. It's Andrew tomorrow. So bye for now. See you later.
Bye.